Lecture 24, NEOM. In September 2025, the Public Investment Fund stopped signing new checks for the project it had spent years describing as inevitable. The language that leaked out wasn't apocalyptic, it was managerial. Construction paused for a strategic review, contractors told to wait, and whole work streams frozen in place like someone had hit a keyboard shortcut for undo. Photographs from that same year showed what strategic review looks like on the ground: heavy equipment parked in open desert, graded stretches that end abruptly, and temporary roads leading to nowhere in particular. The pause arrived after a year of smaller signals, Nadmi al-Nasser leaving his role as NEOM's chief executive in late 2024, Ayman Al-Mudayfa taking over from the PIF side, and reports of internal audits that described progress reporting as something closer to theatre than accounting. An April 2024 leak had already reduced the near-term ambitions to a first segment measured in single-digit kilometers and a population goal under 300,000 by 2030, with the full 170 kilometers pushed to 2045, and an internal board presentation forecasting a final completion date in 2080 with a price tag in the trillions. While that future was being rescheduled, a different set of papers stayed stubbornly on calendar. Human rights groups continued to cite the case of Shadli al-Huwaiti, a member of the Huwaita tribe sentenced to death in proceedings tied to resistance to evictions, his name appearing not in a capital plan but in a legal file that doesn't come with a pilot phase. 8 years earlier, on October 24, 2017, the project began with a document designed to sound like geography itself had been invented that morning. The PIF press release announcing NEOM framed it as the destination for the future, stamped it with an area, 26,500 square kilometers, and described it as a zone that would span borders, reaching toward Jordan and Egypt while remaining under Saudi sovereignty. It attached a number that functioned as both budget and incantation, $500 billion in backing from the kingdom and the fund. It also carried the most operational promise in the entire launch: NEOM would have its own regulatory framework, independent of the kingdom's existing governmental framework except for sovereign matters. On paper, that single clause turned land into a separate legal object, Saudi territory with a carve-out, a place where rules could be rewritten to make investors comfortable. The release offered the usual portfolio of future sectors: technology, tourism, energy, yet the real product was autonomy, a pledge that the state could behave like a startup accelerator without stopping being a state. The Huwaita villages inside the designated footprint did not appear in that announcement except as absence. Shadli al-Huwaiti's later court case exists partly because the press release treated inhabited land as a platform and treated relocation as an implementation detail. 2 days after the press release, on October 26, 2017, Reuters published an interview that tightened the concept into a sentence you could take into a boardroom. Mohammed bin Salman called NEOM the first capitalist city in the world, and he described governance not as elections or ministries but as a CEO governor whose job would be single-minded economic prosperity. He contrasted it with existing cities. New York was the convenient reference point, where governments spend time managing problems rather than hunting growth. He said NEOM would be listed publicly, floated on stock markets, which meant the vision was being built from the start with an exit strategy in mind, as if urbanism were a venture-backed asset class waiting for liquidity. He also signaled what autonomy meant in practice: apart from sovereign matters, different social rules, entertainment, lifestyle freedoms, and a looser posture than the country's strict norms. In an English-language interview from the same window, he clarified that sovereign laws would remain within the framework of Saudi law, which is how you announce a break from the past while keeping the chain of command intact. The investor pitch had a clean internal logic: if Saudi Arabia needed to transform beyond oil under Vision 2030, then a city engineered from scratch could be a proof of concept. On the ground, the logic created a different kind of proof. When a state declares a place independent on paper, it can also declare the people on that land negotiable, and the negotiability shows up later as sentencing in a specialized criminal court, the route Shadli al-Huwaiti's life was forced into. By early 2018, NEOM's structure started to look less like a slogan and more like a corporate diagram. NEOM became a company, wholly owned by the PIF, and the project acquired the kinds of leadership names that make financiers feel they're dealing with a manageable thing. Klaus Kleinfeld, a former Siemens and Alcoa executive, brought in as an early chief executive before the role shifted later to Nadmi al-Nasser. The project's engine was always the fund, MBS as PIF chairman, an internal checkbook fueled by oil revenues and state-directed asset transfers. So early financing decisions weren't the result of investor consensus, they were the result of hierarchy. The promise of a $500 billion backing was not a fundraising milestone in the usual sense. It was a signal that the state had decided the first phase of belief would be purchased internally, long enough for private money to arrive later and pretend it had discovered something. Deals were announced and courted in the language of inevitability. SoftBank's Vision Fund discussions floated the idea of major investment, with Masayoshi Son intrigued by a city pitched as a laboratory for frontier tech. Global consultancies, McKinsey, BCG, Oliver Wyman, were hired to translate ambition into decks and work streams, the modern equivalent of founding charters, except the charter now came with slide numbers and billable hours. The most basic question, what exactly are you building, was treated as solvable through enough planning sessions, because the money was already committed and the destination had already been named. The early promises required numbers big enough to justify the numbers funding them, so the project began to talk like a national economic plan packaged as a lifestyle brand. Official materials promised 380,000 jobs of the future by 2030 and a contribution of SAR $180 billion, about $48 billion, to Saudi GDP. Figures meant to reassure young Saudis that this wasn't just an architecture meme but an employment engine. Marketing language promised to attract the world's greatest minds and best talents, a brain game narrative designed to turn a remote corner of Tabuk province into a magnet. The business incentives were floated as if they were features of an app: free zone arrangements, no corporate taxes, bespoke legal frameworks, profit sharing, special courts. MBS claimed in 2019 that companies like Amazon, Google, and aerospace firms were already in discussions to set up there, the kind of name-dropping that works even when it never turns into a signed lease. Events and sponsorships padded the myth. NEOM branding appeared at high-profile gatherings, including Formula E, with immersive pavilions and promotional videos of drones, lab coats, and augmented reality glasses. The slogan, "The future has a new home," is easy to print on a website. It is harder to reconcile with the idea of a city being floated on stock markets before it has residents, like selling shares in a neighborhood that hasn't been zoned yet. The consultant imagination, lubricated by PIF money and the freedom to treat feasible as a later stage problem, generated a parallel NEOM that existed almost entirely as PowerPoint. A leak reported in 2019 described proposals that sounded like a child's wish list with procurement codes, flying cars, robot dinosaurs, glow-in-the-dark beaches, genetic engineering labs, an artificial moon. A consulting industry analysis of that leak traced which firms had been involved and how the proposals made it into strategy documents, which mattered because these weren't just jokes told at a brainstorm, they were artifacts that helped justify budgets. An internal motto later surfaced: no idea is too big, no detail too small, which reads differently depending on whether you imagine it above a whiteboard or above a bulldozer. The narrative needed the world to treat this as serious, so a roster of high-status advisors was assembled. An 18-member advisory board announced around 2018 with names like Sam Altman, Mark Andreessen, Travis Kalanick, and architect Norman Foster. Those names functioned as social proof. If these people are in the room must be real. Then politics interfered with investor theater. After Jamal Khashoggi's murder in October 2018, reputational risk became a financing constraint, and reports described Western investors pausing and SoftBank quietly stepping back from heavy involvement despite earlier interest. Money can buy renderings, it can't buy trust at the same rate, and the project's early years were spent trying to replace trust with spectacle. For NEOM to exist as more than a global mood board, it needed land that could be treated as controllable. The project's chosen location was presented as both breathtaking and strategic: roughly 500 kilometers of Red Sea coastline, coastal plains rising into rocky Hijaz Mountains, a corner of the country close to Jordan and Egypt with proximity to global shipping lanes and a tourism-friendly landscape. Saudi officials praised it as virgin land, a phrase that does a lot of work in one breath: beauty, emptiness, permission. In the story told to investors, remoteness was a feature because it allowed a clean start and kept the experiment buffered from the habits of existing cities. In the story told by the people living there, remoteness was also a feature, but for the opposite reason: it made the communities politically weaker and easier to relocate. The land was not empty. It was home to the Huaytat tribe and other communities with villages, farms, and histories that did not require a press release to exist. When international coverage later focused on resistance, it often treated the conflict as a surprising twist. For residents, the surprise was that an inhabited region could be described so casually as a blank canvas. Shadli al-Huwaiti's later prosecution is legible only once you accept that the project required not just engineering but erasure, an administrative transformation of people into obstacles. By 2018, word had reached roughly 20,000 Huwaitat in the NEOM area that they would need to move. The initial response described in reports was confusion and disbelief, matched by vague governmental assurances about compensation and new housing, promises broad enough to be repeated and thin enough to be adjusted later. The villages named in accounts, Kureba, Sharma, Gail, and others, sat in the path of NEOM's core developments, including early pilot areas and planned corridors. The fact that Saudi Arabia had relocated tribes before, for projects like military bases, mattered because it established precedent. Relocation was not an unimaginable act of state, it was a known tool. What drew international attention here was scale and enforcement. A September 2020 report by ALQST documented eviction notices and expropriation orders affecting about 500 households across those villages, with copies of notices and testimonies describing intimidation and lack of consultation. The paperwork itself becomes a kind of architectural drawing. You don't need a rendering to understand what is being built when an expropriation order tells you your home is in the way. Shadli al-Huwaiti is not documented in those notices by name in the public summaries, but the mechanism that later produced his death sentence begins with that kind of document. Land turned into a project site by administrative order. In 2020, the project's relationship to the land hardened into enforcement. Authorities began to push evictions in earnest, and what had been described as a future lifestyle ecosystem became, for residents, a schedule of deadlines. One emblematic case that international media repeatedly returned to was Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti, who filmed himself refusing to leave and was later killed in April 2020 when security forces stormed his home. The government narrative said he opened fire first, while activists and rights groups described it as an extrajudicial killing. In the wake of that death, reports described arrests of other tribe members and a push by authorities to co-opt tribal leaders to reduce resistance. Human Rights Watch issued statements calling for compensation and an end to harassment, and later published a report with a title that sounded like a bargaining position turned inside out: Die first, and I'll pay you later, built around accounts of forced evictions and intimidation. Satellite images in subsequent years were cited as confirmation that villages had been razed, turning the Virgin Land slogan into something measurable. Roofs disappear, roads end, and the absence becomes the new infrastructure. The collision between marketing and demolition doesn't require commentary, the documents do it themselves, one page promising the future, another page authorizing removal of the present. As the demolitions continued, the official story emphasized benevolence and modernization. Saudi statements described relocation to better housing and fair compensation, and pro-government framing presented the project as a national upgrade that would benefit citizens and the economy. Rights organizations and displaced residents described a different practice: coercion, intimidation, and a lack of meaningful legal recourse. UN special rapporteurs said the evictions may constitute forced eviction contrary to international law, which is a diplomatic sentence that still carries the idea of a crime. This is where autonomy, the prized feature sold to investors in 2017, begins to look like something else: a zone with bespoke rules that can also function as a zone with bespoke punishments. In reports, the Huwaitat moved from being an inconvenient footnote to being treated as an opposition category, with some members labeled terrorists for protesting eviction, language that changes what the state can do next. Shadli al-Huwaiti's name enters the public record in this phase not as a resident being relocated but as a defendant being processed, which is a different kind of displacement. The body removed from the land and placed inside a legal apparatus built for national security cases. In early 2022, Saudi Arabia's specialized criminal court handed down sentences that made the project's territorial claim enforceable in the most direct way possible. Reports described 3 Huwaitat men sentenced to death and others given long prison terms, some as high as 50 years, linked to resistance or speech about the evictions. The specialized criminal court is not a zoning board, it is a court associated in public reporting with terrorism cases, which is why the choice of venue matters. The state's message was not subtle: the land is not negotiable, and contesting it will be treated as something worse than a property dispute. The conflict between image and enforcement sharpened because the global NEOM brand was built on inclusivity and futuristic uplift, while the domestic enforcement mechanism relied on intimidation and severe punishment. Shadli al-Huwaiti is identified in coverage as among those facing a death sentence connected to this resistance, and that connection turns a megaproject into a matter of life and death for specific individuals, not as metaphor but as court outcome. By September 13, 2022, accounts of Shadli al-Huwaiti's detention added the kind of procedural detail that makes the system feel physical. Middle East reported that he had been tortured, that he went on hunger strike, and that he was violently force-fed, an act that transforms a protest into a medical procedure performed under coercion. ALQST's reporting linked his case to the broader pattern of punishing opposition to evictions, and the death sentence attached to him turned the project's land clearance effort into a legal battleground with irreversible stakes. This is paper doing what paper does best: converting messy reality into standardized outcomes: charge, sentence, appeal. The same state that can commission consulting slides about robot dinosaurs can also commission medical staff to force-feed a prisoner, both require budgets, authorization, and institutional compliance, and both can be written up afterward in neutral language. In Shudley's case, the neutrality is the most chilling part. Force-fed reads like a checkbox until you imagine the restraints and the guards that make it possible. On May 3, 2023, UN experts issued a warning that 3 men were at imminent risk of execution in relation to the NEOM evictions, another document in the growing file that treats the project not as a design challenge but as a rights crisis. The UN's intervention was framed in the cautious language of international oversight, urging a halt, raising alarm, yet the need for repeated warnings suggested how limited that oversight is when sovereignty is the one rule the project never promised to rewrite. By May 2025, rights groups such as ALQSD and Human Rights Watch were still intensifying calls for death sentences to be dropped in cases connected to the displacement, noting that courts had quietly upheld sentences on final appeal, an administrative outcome delivered without the fanfare of the original 2017 launch. The project's public timelines shifted and stretched, 2030 targets revised, 2045 pushed, 2080 imagined, while legal timelines moved with their own logic, where a delay is not a budget adjustment but a stay of execution. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's continued presence in these reports is the through line that doesn't care how many kilometers of mirrored skyscraper are postponed. The court document exists regardless of whether the construction site is active. In the public narrative, NEOM began as a place that would be like no other, and by 2025 the phrase, just a line on paper, circulated as an Arabic joke about a city that still mostly existed in drawings. The joke lands because it's accurate in 2 directions at once. There is the line as architectural concept, a plan so enormous that it invites ridicule when translated into trenches and schedules, and there is the line as bureaucratic instrument, the ink stroke that redraws a region into a special zone, issues an expropriation order, or upholds a death sentence on final appeal. A strategic review can pause procurement, it doesn't reverse a demolition already completed, and it doesn't erase a conviction already entered into a court record. By the time funding was halted in September 2025, the project had already done the part that doesn't require imported glass or international buy-in. It had asserted ownership of the land through notices, removals, and punishments. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's case sits in the middle of that assertion, an ordinary man turned into a named obstacle and then into a condemned defendant, all while the official story continued to describe the same ground as pristine, untouched, ready for the future, and waiting. On the next page, the language changes from indictment to marketing, and it does it without changing the underlying geography. The May 3, 2023 press release from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is still talking about the same strip of northwest Saudi Arabia when it warns that 3 members of the Huwaitat tribe face execution for nothing more than peacefully resisting forced displacement, and when it names Shadli Al-Huwaiti as one of the men on death row linked to the NEOM evictions. The NEOM newsroom, 2 years earlier on January 10, 2021, is also talking about that strip when it announces the line as a revolution in urban living, assigns it a clean measurement, 170 kilometers, and claims that 95% of the surrounding land will be preserved for nature. In one set of documents, the state's power appears as a court and a sentence. In another, it appears as a promise that nature will be safe if the city is folded into a straight line and stacked vertically. Shadli's name, typed into international human rights language and into legal paperwork at home, sits in the same project folder as the phrase, a revolution in urban living, because the folder is not organized by tone, it's organized by jurisdiction. The official version of the revolution is built out of numbers that are meant to feel soothing. A press release can say 170 kilometers and make it sound like a carefully chosen dose. It can say 5-minute walk to daily needs, no cars, no streets, 100% renewable energy, and then add the kind of timeline that makes the whole thing sound like an infrastructure project rather than a civilizational rewrite. Construction beginning in the first quarter of 2021, 1 million residents by 2030, a population later pitched at 9 million, an end state that's described as zero carbon. Reuters, in its reporting on the January 2021 launch, attaches a cost range, $100 billion to $200 billion for infrastructure, and places the line inside Vision 2030's logic of GDP and jobs. When the design is revised in July 2022, state media and Reuters add more numbers, 200 meters wide, 500 meters tall, 9 million people. The density is sold as kindness, less sprawl, less land destroyed, while the building itself is treated as an environmental solution by definition. The claim is that a city this compact frees everything else to become nature, and the policy language that follows, preserve 95%, create reserves, reintroduce species, reads like a conservation program with a skyline attached. On the enforcement side, the lived version of that compactness is that a region that used to be navigated by families, herds, roads, and memory becomes navigated by survey lines, exclusion zones, and deadlines. And the deadline is enforced hard enough that Shadli Al-Huwaiti ends up facing a death sentence in a case that international reporters describe as tied to resisting displacement. The green promise has to survive the moment it becomes engineering, and the paper trail shows where it frays. Environmental groups and bird protection organizations can look at a 170-kilometer mirrored corridor on a major migratory flyway, Europe to Africa, Asia to Africa, and see a collision course that doesn't care what the branding team called the project. In planning documents reviewed by the Wall Street Journal and later described by Business Insider in May 2024, NEOM's own designers reportedly warn that bird deaths will be inevitable along the mirrored facade, and the documents don't just say it in prose, they illustrate it with an image of a dead bird. The design they're worried about is specific: twin towers around 1,640 feet high, about 656 feet apart, forming a straight reflective wall across the landscape. A dead bird graphic is not a typical feature of a futuristic city reveal, but it's the kind of thing that happens when someone has to turn a slogan, "Interact with nature," into a risk assessment. Dennis Hickey, TG Line's Chief Development Officer, can sit in a promotional interview in early 2023 and talk about a better model for a city to interact with nature. The planning deck, in a different register, tries to prevent the interaction from becoming a mass casualty event for migrating birds. The collision is mundane in the way only internal documents can be: two different departments describing the same mirror, one as a breakthrough, one as a trap, and both treating the outcome as a management issue. The carbon-neutral story has similar seams, because zero carbon is not a design aesthetic, it's a materials ledger. In October 2024, NEOM's Chief Investment Officer Mana Al-Manif tells an audience at a Riyadh forum that NEOM is already consuming 20% of all the steel produced in the world, and that the project will be the world's largest buyer of construction materials for decades, accounting for roughly 5% of global logistics demand. Taken literally, it's a statement about ships, trucks, ports, and factories as much as it's a statement about architecture, and it lands awkwardly inside a project whose flagship city is pitched as the antidote to industrial waste. The policy response to that scale is to lean harder on clean energy infrastructure, NEOM's energy subsidiary Enowa, and the widely publicized $5 billion green hydrogen plant being developed with Air Products and ACWA Power, meant to supply a clean energy system and exportable fuel. The practice on the ground still begins with blasting rock, pouring concrete, driving diesel equipment through a desert, and building desalination plants that produce brine that has to go somewhere on a Red Sea coastline that is also being marketed for luxury tourism and marine spectacle. The green claim is written as if it begins at the ribbon cutting, the environmental reality begins at the quarry. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's case, filed under the harshest possible consequences, sits beside this green ledger as an uninvited annotation. The preservation of nature is being purchased not only with steel and logistics but also with the kind of compliance that comes from knowing what happens when you refuse to move. There's a second promise embedded in the early NEOM material that matters as much as the environmental one, that the city will not only be clean, it will be governed differently. The October 24, 2017 announcement tied to the project's launch describes NEOM as a business zone with its own regulatory framework, independent of the existing governmental framework, with the caveat that it remains within Saudi sovereignty. Around that same period, Mohammed bin Salman tells interviewers and audiences that NEOM's sovereign laws will exist within the framework of Saudi law, a phrasing that manages to say different and the same in a single breath. The public claim is a kind of charter city dream, a place with courts, security, labor rules, and social norms designed for investors, experts, and the future, not for the old constraints. It's also framed as an economic instrument, talk of being publicly traded by 2030, talk of becoming a global hub, talk of a first capitalist city, which implies a legal architecture capable of making ownership and dispute resolution legible to outsiders. The enforcement architecture that shows up in Shadli Al-Huwaiti's story is the opposite of experimental: a specialized criminal court, a death sentence, solitary confinement, medical force, and a response from international experts that treats the evictions as violations of international law. The city is sold as a new jurisdiction, but the punishment is administered through the existing one, and that mismatch becomes the first real governance lesson. The most futuristic governance system in the world still has to share the same police stations. By August 2022, governance is no longer being sold primarily as a regulatory carve-out, it's being sold as a data engine. A Reuters Foundation feature that month frames the line as a test case for treating personal data as currency. Joseph Bradley, NEOM's tech and digital CEO, describes a consent-based platform that would allow residents to decide what data they share and, crucially, be paid for it. The pitch leans on comparison. Normal cities leverage perhaps 1% of their data, he says. NEOM aims for something like 90%. The mechanism is a cognitive city fed by sensors, cameras, smartphones, and facial recognition, using the stream to predict needs and allocate services. The claim is that bureaucracy dissolves into prediction. The city anticipates, the city optimizes, the city becomes a robot, with Bradley and other executives describing NEOM itself as an intelligent system rather than a place. Digital rights experts quoted in the same reporting warn about the obvious failure mode, surveillance, calling it a privacy disaster waiting to happen. Even in the promotional vision, consent is enforced through interface design, a platform, a dashboard, a set of toggles that make the citizen feel like the author of their own monitoring. The dream is that governance becomes a settings menu. The reality is that the project's most consequential settings, who can remain on the land, who can protest, who can refuse, are still being adjusted in courtrooms where Shadli Al-Huwaiti's name is printed under the word execution, and the only consent mechanism is whether the state has decided to stop. This is where the ordinary logic of the project exposes itself, because consent as a product feature depends on a baseline of voluntary participation, and the NEOM story has already documented what happens when someone's participation is involuntary. The OHCHR press release in May 2023 does not describe a dispute over data, it describes men facing death for resisting displacement. Middle East Eye, reporting in September 2022 on the sentencing of Huwaitat protesters, places Shadli Al-Huwaiti in a narrative of escalation, arrest, trial, capital sentence, linked to opposing evictions for NEOM. Al-Quds Al-Arabi, in May 2023, reports that Shadli went on hunger strike, was force-fed, and was held in solitary confinement. Those are governance procedures too, just not the kind that come with a glossy user interface. A city that promises to pay residents for their data is also the context for a man being strapped down for a feeding tube because the state has decided that his body is part of the enforcement landscape. The claim is frictionless urbanism, the practice involves physical coercion. The policy that matters most in that moment is not an AI ethics charter, it's a prison administration decision that treats a hunger strike as a compliance problem. It's difficult to talk about consent-based platforms in the same folder as force-fed, and that difficulty is not rhetorical, it's structural, because both are produced by the same authority. There's a quieter layer of governance work that shows up not as law or force but as reputation management. In U.S. foreign agent filings, the consulting and communications firm Teneo signs a contract in December 2019 to provide NEOM with strategic communications support, including disaster management planning, for a reported $2 million. The deliverables are the kind of documents that never appear in utopian renderings: messaging guidance, stakeholder maps, crisis response timelines, the language that will be used when reality makes contact with reporting. The practice is visible in what happens when journalists ask NEOM about the Huwaitat evictions and get no substantive response, while official Saudi outlets publish statements about community relocation that emphasize fair compensation and new housing and omit the arrests, violence, and death sentences documented by human rights organizations. This is governance by narrative. The project maintains a clean storyline about nature reserves and innovation labs while the enforcement storyline is handled elsewhere, in courts and detention facilities. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's name becomes, in that system, not only a person but a reputational risk event, an item that communications contractors plan around, not because they can change the sentence, but because they can try to keep the sentence from changing the investor mood. The future described in these materials also requires a kind of governance that is boring in the way utopias rarely admit. A city that is also a building needs ownership frameworks, registries, and adjudication systems that can decide which floor belongs to which person, which corridor belongs to which operator, and what it means to own something in a vertical stack that's meant to house millions. The original NEOM launch language about an independent regulatory framework is implicitly a promise to build that apparatus: condo-style property structures, long-term leaseholds, zoning rules that are expressed in meters and floors rather than blocks and streets, and dispute resolution that convinces foreign investors their contracts will be honored. None of that is cinematic. It is the paperwork spine beneath the rendered gardens. The city can be marketed as a robot, but the robot still needs a filing system, because ownership is not an emotion, it's a chain of documents. When officials talk about sovereign laws within a Saudi framework, they are describing the legal trick required to make a controlled exception zone that still serves national sovereignty. The project's dream of autonomy is real only to the extent that it can be written into enforceable rules, and the enforceability, in practice, is demonstrated most vividly not in a property registry but in how efficiently a death sentence can be produced and maintained. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's case does not prove that NEOM has new courts, it proves that the old ones are fully operational. By the time the project reaches its most iconic architectural claims, the governance story is already embedded in the building's geometry. On July 25, 2022, Saudi state media unveils the revised design of the line, a pair of mirrored walls 500 meters tall and 200 meters wide, running 170 kilometers, intended to house up to 9 million people. Reuters reports the details the next day and repeats the anchor promises: no cars, no roads, high-speed rail running the length in about 20 minutes, everything within a 5-minute walk. The architectural concept is branded as zero-gravity urbanism, a phrase that tries to make vertical zoning sound like a law of physics rather than a planning choice. Residences layered above services, public realm stacked rather than spread, infrastructure tunneled beneath. The claim is that the city will be dense without being cramped, and that the mirror itself will disappear into the landscape by reflecting it, turning the building into a kind of invisible object that just happens to be 500 meters tall. In internal planning documents, the mirror is not invisible, it's a hazard to migrating birds. In material scale speeches, the mirror is not a reflection, it's steel, glass, and logistics. The city that's meant to look like nothing still has to be delivered by supply chains that are very visible to anyone living near the route: convoys, cranes, excavations, work lights, an entire temporary industrial city built to create a permanent one. The physical act of making the line begins with cuts that do not look futuristic at all. Reuters reports in early 2021 that construction would commence by the end of the first quarter. Satellite imagery and subsequent reporting describe a long, straight scar of excavation along parts of the route as ground surveys and blasting begin. By late 2021, reporting notes trenches being dug and construction villages being established, the first stage of a project that, in renderings, has no streets but in reality starts with the oldest kind of linear infrastructure, a path made for trucks, drills, and concrete. The official claim is that a high-speed spine will move people end-to-end in 20 minutes, implying trains approaching 500 kilometers per hour. The practice at this stage is the movement of rock and soil. The policy language is about preserving nature, the practice is about relocating nature temporarily into piles, berms, and spoil heaps. Even the word line changes meaning. In the press release it's a design ideal, on the ground it's a trench that needs fencing, lighting, and guards. Shadli Al-Huwaiti's home region becomes, in this stage, a worksite jurisdiction, where access and movement are determined by permits and security checkpoints rather than tradition, and where the cost of refusing to comply has already been demonstrated in court. The project's more extravagant technology fantasies sit uneasily on top of this earthwork reality, but they are part of the same institutional archive. Leaked planning materials referenced in major reporting, including a Guardian investigation in May 2020, describe ideas that feel less like urban planning than like a showroom designed to keep a billionaire's attention: an artificial moon to light the night sky, glow in the dark, sand on the beaches, robot dinosaurs as entertainment, robot maids and hologram teachers as default services, even talk of genetic engineering and cloud seeding. Some of these concepts are presented in the language of innovation labs and tourism experiences, some are pitched as infrastructure. The fantastical elements are not just jokes, they are recruitment tools for partners and consultants, the kind of talking points that make a desert project sound like a destination rather than a cost center. The list of firms associated with NEOM planning, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Oliver Wyman, and others, signals the corporate machinery needed to translate fantasy into procurement. SoftBank's Masayoshi Son is reported to have been enthusiastic early on, then quieter after 2018, as political risk and the project scale made the dream harder to finance with outside capital. In this layer of the archive, the city is not a place where people live, it's a set of features to be unveiled. Artificial moon reads, in that context, like an amenity line item. It's also a reminder that the project's core unit of reality is not a neighborhood, it's a slide. Those slides still have to land somewhere, and the place they land is a workforce that does not live in mirrors. By late 2021, thousands of construction workers, recruited largely from South Asia, are being brought to NEOM, and the first large worker camp is established with the plain name, Camp 1, which sounds like a temporary file folder rather than a home. By 2022, tens of thousands of workers from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Egypt, and elsewhere are housed in sprawling desert camps, and reporting suggests around 100,000 workers are on site by 2023. Their work is not holographic. It is blasting rock, pouring concrete, driving trucks, assembling prefabricated elements, working long shifts in extreme heat that can reach toward 45 degrees Celsius. The grand promise of a city where services are automated and bureaucracy disappears still requires a vast human logistics operation, recruitment agencies, visa processing, transport to a remote site, food supply, medical care, accommodation maintenance, and security. The official story rarely lingers on any of those systems because they do not look like the future, they look like management. The future, in practice, begins with inventory, helmets, boots, water, beds, and the rules for who is allowed to leave. When that logistics system fails, it does not fail in a way that can be fixed with a new render. In 2022, reports describe worker unrest and riots in a camp, triggered by frustration over poor food and possibly unpaid wages, a protest that turned violent. In the Gulf labor context, that kind of protest is already an act that carries risk, because Saudi labor law does not allow unions and strikes are illegal, leaving workers with little formal recourse. An internal security report by Serco in 2022, later reported on through investigative journalism, flags that nearly 168 worker camps at NEOM were substandard, overcrowded, lacking amenities, with some workers sleeping in shifts and sharing the same bed. The report also warns that Saudi police capacity in the remote area is insufficient, meaning the enforcement layer that keeps a megaproject orderly has to be improvised, more private security, more internal controls, more barriers between camps and the outside. The city marketed as a triumph of intelligent planning is, at this stage, a patchwork of camps whose conditions resemble the oldest pattern in Gulf construction: speed over comfort, deadlines over dignity, visibility over welfare. The most honest piece of smart city language in that context is the numbering system, Camp 1, Camp 2, because it admits what the workers already know: they are part of a temporary infrastructure built to disappear. By late 2023 and into 2024, glimpses of the labor system leak through in ways that are hard to reconcile with the official vision of frictionless living. A Wall Street Journal investigation published in December 2024 describes dangerous working conditions, lax safety standards, and deaths, 8 workers officially recorded in 2023, alongside accounts of serious crime in the camps, including drug dealing and sexual violence. The same reporting includes a detail that sounds like a bureaucratic error until you remember how frontier work sites operate: an 8-year-old child found driving a truck on site, child labor appearing inside a project that sells itself as the pinnacle of modernization. The story also includes a fatal head-on crash involving a McKinsey consultant after repeated warnings about dangerous nighttime driving, an example of how risk can be documented, filed, and then ignored until it becomes a death. These are not aesthetic failures, they are governance failures, the kind that emerge when a project is scaled so fast that enforcement and safety become secondary to visible progress. The claim is that AI will anticipate needs, the practice is that safety staff can anticipate a hazard and still lose the argument to schedule. A mirror city does not reflect the labor camp behind it unless someone forces the reflection into public view. NEOM's leadership can plausibly argue that the construction phase is not the finished city, that the worker camps are temporary, that the future will be cleaner. That defense still runs into the stubborn fact that the project operates inside a national labor environment where workers' rights are constrained by law and by geography. Saudi Arabia's kafala sponsorship system, even with nominal reforms, ties many migrant workers' legal status to employers, creating vulnerabilities that human rights organizations have documented for years: unpaid wages, passport confiscation, restricted mobility, fear of retaliation. The research record around NEOM suggests that whatever special labor regime is promised for the finished zone, Saudi labor law largely applies in practice while new regulations remain unclear, and the project's isolation, a fenced desert worksite far from existing cities, functions as a physical enforcement tool regardless of what the policy documents say. NEOM has officially reported minimal disruption during the pandemic and 0 COVID-19 deaths among workers, claims that observers treat skeptically given cramped living conditions and a lack of transparency. A channel for documentary's broader allegation, tens of thousands of deaths across Vision 2030 projects, cannot be treated as a verified NEOM ledger, but it speaks to the wider Gulf pattern of fatalities being categorized as natural causes in extreme heat, keeping them out of formal accountability. In this environment, rights are often experienced as a set of permissions: permission to transfer jobs, permission to leave the site, permission to complain, permission to be heard. Shadli al-Huwaiti's name returns here not as a metaphor but as a warning label attached to the whole enterprise. The UN experts who urged Saudi Arabia in May 2023 to halt executions linked to the NEOM evictions were describing a state response to resistance that does not look experimental. Human Rights Watch, in a major report in November 2024 connecting public investment fund projects to abuses, documents the forced evictions of the Huwaitat, arrests of protesters, the killing of one protesting resident, 2 50-year prison terms, and death sentences for 3 others. In some testimonies referenced in human rights reporting, members of the displaced community are described as being forced into the cruel loop of working on the project that took their homes. That is the system tightening around an ordinary person in its most literal form: land removed, resistance criminalized, labor extracted, narrative managed, and the city's clean future sold as a product that requires all of it. The project's promotional language can describe a consent platform that pays residents for data, but the enforceable reality recorded in courts and camps is that the most valuable data point is still whether a person complies. The next convoy that moves along the trench does not travel through a robot city, it travels through a zone where the future has been broken down into shifts, permits, and guarded gates. The gate had a serial number, and the death that followed didn't halt the supply chain so much as add a new kind of paperwork to it: an incident report for the subcontractor, a notation for the camp clinic, a message up the line that a man from Pakistan had been struck hard enough that his family would later be described as receiving little compensation. By 2023, the camp that made that gate necessary wasn't an improvisation anymore. It was an operating system, one of many, expanding across a coastal desert in the Tabuk region under the same national labor architecture that NEOM's own documents said it intended to rise above. Reports and estimates had the construction workforce at 50,000 plus by mid-2023 and closer to 100,000 by late 2023, much of it recruited from South Asia, sleeping in construction village, grids that had to be fed, guarded, and moved by bus because the promised city without roads begins, in practice, with road logistics. A worker welfare charter existed as a policy artifact, something that could be cited in a press environment, but by the time the Wall Street Journal would later describe internal audits and security lapses, the project's most consistent product wasn't a skyline. It was a remote, sprawling labor apparatus that had to function every day, regardless of whether the wall rose on schedule. The first stress in scaling isn't philosophical. It's that the early commitments are lumpy and irreversible. A tunneling contract doesn't care about the vibe of a render, it cares about rock, machinery, and the calendar. By March 2022, consortiums with names that signal heavy infrastructure were being reported as winners on work tied to the rail spine, packages involving FCC, Samsung C&T, Webuild and local partners, with one rail tunnel package described around $1.4 billion for roughly 57 kilometers. Those numbers didn't make a city inevitable, but they made invoices inevitable, and they made delay a cash phenomenon rather than an aesthetic one. In July 2023, Reuters reported delays in payments to some suppliers, and the detail matters because NEOM's myth is unlimited momentum while its practice still relies on ordinary capital mechanics, vendors who want to be paid, contractors who shift deadlines when payments slip, and a sovereign fund that can be supportive in public while quietly forcing triage in budget meetings. A megaproject can be presented as a single clean line. The back end is 1,000 separate obligations, each with its own interest rate disguised as a due date. When you try to bring something like this to scale, the infrastructure that supports the vision starts to look like a second city squatting beside the first. Construction photos and trade reporting through 2023 pointed to prefab plants, massive base camps, and foundational walls rising in at least one segment to something like 20 meters. Real built work that doesn't look like the advertising because it can't. Satellite imagery by the end of 2023 suggested multiple excavation segments, around a dozen, along the planned route. Scars cut into earth without the mirrored surfaces that were supposed to turn the desert into a postcard. NEOM's own public updates stayed vague, offering little in the way of kilometers excavated or cash spent. The clarity came from the blunt geometry of what could be seen from above. In a normal city, progress is felt in new shops, occupied apartments, street repairs. Here, progress was measured in trench lengths, piling rigs on the coast, and the expanding perimeter of worker accommodation labeled with the kind of names you give to temporary solutions when you suspect the temporary solution will outlast the dream. The scaling problem also has a material face, and by late 2024 it acquired an almost surreal metric. At an October 2024 forum, NEOM's chief investment officer, Mana Al-Manif, was reported as saying the project would consume about 1/5 of global steel production, and that figure landed because it translated "city of the future" into the simplest industrial fact: the future weighs a lot. Another reported figure attached to the same moment, about 5% of global logistics demand, did something similar, turning a supposedly elegant solution to sprawl into an announcement that the supply chain of the planet would need to bend around a single strip of coast. The public-facing promise had always been zero cars and zero streets. The operational reality, stated in an almost cheerful corporate register, was that the build required a volume of steel and shipping that would make an ordinary metropolis blush. A project can declare itself post-carbon, It still has to negotiate with the world that makes beams, pours concrete, and moves freight on schedules that do not care what a concept video called the design philosophy. The human scaling of the project is where the story starts to thicken into pressure. Nadmi Al-Nosser, NEOM's CEO through 2024, was described in later reporting as running staff with extreme expectations and a punishing internal culture. What matters for the system is not the insult of any quote, but the incentive structure it implies. In a regime where the founder's vision is also a national branding instrument, a project manager's safest move is to make dashboards look good. When the Wall Street Journal later described internal audits that found manipulated progress reporting and deliberate manipulation, it offered the kind of bureaucratic language that tells you the myth has begun eating the measurement tools. A real city can survive ugly data, it's built to absorb complaint and iteration. A myth city has a different vulnerability. The numbers aren't just numbers, they're the proof of allegiance. So the internal apparatus begins to prefer optimistic reporting over accurate reporting, and accuracy becomes a career risk in a place where failure is not supposed to exist as a concept. The story of Abdul Rahim Al-Huwaiti sits inside this scaling phase like a pinned document that refuses to be filed away. He was not a minister, not a developer, not a CEO. He was a resident in the Tabuk region whose home was in the planned footprint, and he became legible to the outside world because he posted videos in 2020 refusing eviction. The state's version of the event framed his death in April 2020 as the outcome of a security operation. Rights groups described it as an extrajudicial killing. Either way, a man ended up dead because he would not accept a relocation that the project treated as an administrative step. When the project later spoke in the language of preserving 95% of nature, the necessary companion document was the eviction notice, the paper that says a living map can be erased by decree. His name became an unofficial caption beneath the renderings, a reminder that the clean line requires the messiest kind of enforcement to draw. By 2023, a separate document was circulating that made the same point without naming him, a Serco risk assessment report, later described as finding worker camps underregulated and security understaffed, warning that Saudi police capacity in the remote area was insufficient. The camps weren't simply a humanitarian concern, they were a governance concern, because under-provisioned security and basic services in a settlement of tens of thousands can turn into unrest. And unrest is the one kind of spontaneity a prestige project can't tolerate. Around this period there were also reports, unofficial, often outside Saudi media, of protests and disturbances tied to food quality or delayed wages. An NEOM's own internal safety audit would be described as acknowledging 8 worker deaths in 2022. Each of these facts is a different kind of anchor, the risk report, the safety audit, the rumor trail. Together they show how scale converts a visionary city into a set of camps that have to be managed like a volatile municipality, except without municipal politics, because the people living there aren't citizens of a place. They're labor inside a perimeter. A utopia that promises frictionless life tends to meet its first hard friction in the outside world, where disbelief isn't simply an opinion, it's a pricing mechanism. Long before any formal scale-back leak, a legitimacy contest was already underway, with architects, academics, investors, and human rights observers each producing their own receipts. In August 2022, experts quoted in architecture coverage called the sustainability and livability assumptions naive. Later that year The Economist ran skepticism under a proverb-ready title about a line in the sand. In June 2023, an article in NPJ Urban Sustainability did something more damaging than mocking. It modeled the geometry and argued that a long, thin city is structurally inefficient compared to compact forms, proposing the circle as a thought experiment that makes most destinations walkable in a way the line cannot. The critique was not a moral objection, it was math. It talked in distances, densities, ventilation, and the practical absurdity of requiring high-speed transit to make basic life possible across 170 kilometers. NEOM's defenders pushed back in the informality of social media and promotional claims, but the presence of the peer-reviewed argument mattered because it gave skeptical journalists and investors a new kind of vocabulary, not just dystopian, but topologically inefficient. The same outside world was also watching the project's governance contradictions accumulate. NEOM's founding claims were filled with language about international norms and special regulatory frameworks, compatible commercial codes, investor-friendly arbitration, a zone that would feel like a global city rather than a provincial outpost. Yet there was no widely published NEOM city charter laying out what those norms were in enforceable text. What did exist, very clearly, was enforcement against dissent. The story of Abdul Rahim Al-Huwaiti was followed by court proceedings that, by 2022, included severe sentences for tribe members accused of opposing the development. By May 3, 2023, UN experts issued a public appeal urging Saudi Arabia to halt the executions of 3 Huwaitat men on death row connected to NEOM-related protests. Saudi officials dismissed the statement as interference. No execution date was announced, leaving the men in the bureaucratic limbo of a sentence that can be activated whenever the state chooses. For a global audience, the UN document functioned like a warning label, the kind that attaches to a product whether the manufacturer likes it or not. This investment comes with a human rights story that will not stay private. There's also a quieter form of external dissent, people and institutions simply stepping back from the photo. NEOM's early years were thick with high-profile advisory board announcements and celebrity-adjacent names from the tech and finance world. After the Khashoggi murder in 2018 and other controversies, many of those names went quiet, a withdrawal that didn't require a press conference. The same pattern showed up in investor behavior. Foreign direct investment was often described as underwhelming relative to the spectacle of memoranda of understanding, and the difference matters because NEOM's scale was always premised on outside capital joining Saudi capital. When the outside world hesitates, the sovereign fund becomes the buyer of last resort for its own myth, which is an expensive way to diversify an economy away from oil. A utopia can survive ridicule, it struggles with indifference, because indifference is what turns a $1.5 trillion plan into a domestic budget problem. Sometimes the outside world's reaction arrives through a person who thought he was signing a normal contract. In May 2024, Business Insider published an interview with Malcolm Orr, the CEO of a UK firm called Solar Water, who said he cancelled a $100 million contract connected to NEOM after witnessing villages being razed to make way for the project. His account is not important because it proves the total scale of displacement. Rights groups had already been documenting that, so much as because it shows a different enforcement surface, reputation. A foreign executive doesn't have to argue with Saudi courts or police to register dissent. He can simply walk away from a deal and leave behind the kind of quote that investors read twice. NEOM's narrative had sometimes implied the land was virgin, a clean slate for innovation. Orr's description of bulldozed villages punctured that premise using the simplest possible evidence. He saw the buildings come down. That is how the outside world translates ethics into risk, by turning it into a story that makes future partners imagine themselves in the same moment, deciding whether they want their name on that paper. The social media layer did its own translation, one that requires almost no expertise. In Arabic online jokes, the line became just a line on paper, or the mirror of illusion. That's not policy critique, it's genre critique, the recognition that the project's most reliable output is imagery. Even the marketing promise of the mirrored facade helped this along, because a mirror is already a metaphor for surface and for self-regard, and the project picked the metaphor as architecture. When NEOM planners worried internally about bird collisions with the mirrored walls, concerns reported in May 2024 from leaked documents, the collision was literal. A city sold as ecological harmony becoming, in planning notes, a risk of turning migratory routes into a fatal accident. A utopia doesn't have to be mocked to be weakened, it just has to be described in the language of unintended consequences. Dead birds are not a branding asset, especially when your brand is that you've solved the relationship between humans and nature through geometry. Underneath all of this, Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti's case continued to act like an anchor the project could not lift. Rights documentation in 2020 and 2021 had already framed eviction pressure as coercive and compensation as inadequate, with Human Rights Watch putting it under a title that sounded like contract advice: die first, and I'll pay you later. Those words travel because they translate the experience of a household into the legal and financial terms investors understand. A household is offered money to leave, it resists, the state escalates, the person resisting ends up dead, later, other residents end up in court. The outside world doesn't have access to NEOM's internal commercial code, or its draft arbitration clauses, or the real text of its special regulations. It does have access to this sequence of events and to public UN warnings. So the human rights narrative becomes a proxy charter, the de facto document that tells outsiders what kind of zone this is when someone refuses to comply. The project's response to external disbelief wasn't a single statement. It was a pattern: deny, reaffirm, and keep the render pipeline open. In late 2024, NEOM released upbeat, progress, footage, CGI stitched to construction shots, attempting to refresh the mental image. Around the same time, announcements about lead architects were publicized, and big names in engineering and project management continued to orbit the work. This is a familiar strategy in large projects. If the public can't see the whole, show them reputable logos and let the logos stand in for credibility. But the outside world was beginning to demand not prestige but continuity. A peer-reviewed paper doesn't care who the architect is, it cares whether the geometry can deliver light, air, and humane movement. A contractor doesn't care about the philosophy, it cares about payment schedules. A human rights investigator doesn't care about the skyline, they care about who is allowed to say no. In that environment, every new glossy announcement became another opportunity for comparison against the older documents, the press release, the denial, the audit leak, the satellite scar. That comparison snapped into a sharper, more explicit form in April 2024, when Bloomberg reported that internal NEOM documents revised the near-term targets downward. The headline numbers were the kind that make a utopia sound suddenly like a conventional urban development plan, under 300,000 residents by 2030 instead of 1.5 million, and an initial built segment described not as 170 kilometers but as something like 2 to 4 kilometers, with a specific figure circulating around 2.4 kilometers. The report also said the Public Investment Fund delayed approval of NEOM's 2024 budget and that leadership was instructed to prioritize a showcase segment. Those details matter because they connect the myth to its most vulnerable interface, budgeting. The dream can be infinite, the budget approval process is not. A project this scale doesn't get scaled back through public debate, it gets scaled back through line items. The decision doesn't have to be announced as defeat. It can arrive as a quiet instruction to build a demonstrator, to aim for a piece that can be opened and filmed. The official response arrived later that same month with the formality you would expect in a story about image control. Saudi Economy Minister Faisal Al-Ibrahim said publicly, in a CNBC interview on April 29, 2024, that there had been no change in NEOM scope, insisting the projects would go ahead. The denial had to exist because the Bloomberg report introduced a new kind of outside world evidence, not opinion, but internal paperwork described by a mainstream outlet with sources. In a normal political environment, a leaked internal planning document might trigger hearings, resignations, budget renegotiations with public input. In this environment, it triggered a messaging maneuver. The claim remained fixed, proceeding as planned, while the planning itself, according to the leak, had already been recompiled. That gap between public claim and internal practice is not a side drama. It's the central operating principle of a prestige megaproject in an absolute monarchy. The narrative cannot be allowed to admit vulnerability, so the adjustments happen in rooms the public does not enter. Once the project's near-term scope becomes negotiable, the question shifts from, will the 170 kilometers exist, to, what counts as proof? Around this same time, reporting converged on a concrete anchor, a stadium. Multiple sources described plans for a segment of roughly 2.4 kilometers that would include a stadium intended for the 2034 World Cup final. In November 2023, Saudi Arabia won the bid to host Expo 2030 in Riyadh. Trojena was already slated for the 2029 Asian Winter Games. Sindala was discussed as a luxury opening. These deadlines are different in kind from a visionary timeline because they are attached to international event calendars that don't respond well to metaphors. The schedule becomes a form of enforcement, not against dissenters, but against the project itself. You can't explain to FIFA that your city is still, in progress, as a philosophical stance. You either have a venue or you don't. When a utopia starts hunting for an event schedule to tether itself to, it's admitting, without saying so, that the old schedule was too elastic to survive contact with reality. The money story kept catching up with the imagery. In October 2024, The Times reported that the Public Investment Fund took an $8 billion write-down on projects including NEOM, a rare public acknowledgement that the future can lose value on paper before it gains value on the ground. In parallel, the steel consumption figures were circulating, and the juxtaposition was hard to miss, a project described as using 1/5 of global steel, paired with a sovereign fund quietly recording impairment. Those are not contradictory, they are complementary. Massive steel usage is exactly what produces a write-down when the schedule slips, because you have sunk costs that don't turn into revenue for years. This is where the economics of utopia becomes almost old-fashioned. Capital locked into concrete doesn't diversify anything until someone is paying rent, buying tickets, opening factories, living there. Until then, it is a national investment parked in the sand, accruing only reputational return, unless the reputation turns negative, in which case it becomes a liability you are paying to maintain. By November 2024, the organizational chart itself became part of the evidence. Reporting said Nadmi Al-Nasser left abruptly, and Ayman Al-Mudaifa, a PIF real estate executive, was installed as CEO in a restructuring context. Leadership changes in a normal city are political. Leadership changes in a megaproject are often a way of moving accountability without moving the vision. The story that emerged in later investigative reporting suggested a management culture shaped by impossible targets and a desire to please upward rather than report accurately. That dynamic is legible in the language of audits described in 2025. deliberate manipulation of progress reporting. A spreadsheet becomes, in effect, a constitution. What is considered true is what is considered reportable. The city that promised to be cognitive and data-driven ended up demonstrating a primitive data fact. Measurement systems are only as honest as the incentives that govern them. The outside world received its most detailed internal view in March 2025, when the Wall Street Journal published an exposé describing audits, delays, and a 2023 draft board presentation projecting completion in 2080 at a cost of $8.8 trillion, an amount framed as roughly 25 times Saudi Arabia's annual budget. It also reported more than $50 billion already spent with limited visible progress and concerns about whether the project could ever attract the population and private investment required to justify itself. The effect of those numbers wasn't merely shock. They reclassified the project from ambitious to potentially unfinanceable at its advertised scale, at least within the familiar horizon of Vision 2030. The internal document functioned like a cracked mirror, the project's own planning materials reflecting a future that contradicted the public timeline. Once that reflection is out, it can't be put back behind the glass, because it gives every skeptic a hard date, 2080, and every supporter a new problem: how to claim inevitability when your own documents are describing a century-scale build. The same spring, Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti's name resurfaced in outside world paperwork in a different way, as a timestamp. May 2025 brought renewed calls by groups like ALQSD and Human Rights Watch to drop the death sentences against the Huwaitat men, noting that they had been on death row for years, and the press attention sharpened around the third anniversary of his killing in April 2025. The state's approach to this kind of pressure remained consistent: dismiss external appeals, keep legal proceedings opaque, and let time do the work of exhaustion. No execution date being announced is not mercy, it's leverage, because the sentence remains in force. The project that sold itself as a new legal and cultural environment for the future was still operating, on its most consequential human rights questions, within a familiar sovereign pattern. The law is what the state chooses to enforce, when it chooses to enforce it, and the outside world is allowed to watch without intervening. By mid-2025, even the sub-projects that were supposed to provide near-term proof began to slip. Sindala's partial opening was reported as behind schedule, despite earlier talk of a summer 2025 debut. Confidential sources described PIF pumping additional billions into NEOM to pay contractors, which fits the earlier signal from Reuters in 2023 about payment pressure. Cash flow is a governance tool. When the fund has to inject money not to build new wonders but to cover obligations already incurred, the project has moved into a phase where maintaining solvency is itself a daily construction task. In August 2025, The Times reported further write-downs and noted that multiple NEOM sub-projects faced delays and were reportedly scaled back, with hints that national priorities might redirect investment toward more immediately useful infrastructure. That's a different kind of fork than the one sold in the marketing. It isn't the future versus the past. It's one prestige bet versus many smaller, politically safer bets. The most definitive action in the project's reality check arrived not as a televised announcement but as a leak. In September 2025, reporting from outlets including Switzerland's Blick described PIF ordering a suspension of construction at the line until further notice, pending a strategic review. There was no dramatic declaration that the dream was over. There was equipment going idle, workers being let go or reassigned, and the absence of new excavation becoming detectable in subsequent satellite imagery. In November 2025, a German tech outlet summarized international consensus that the megaproject had likely failed in its current form. In December 2025, the Financial Times published an interactive bluntly titled End of the Line, compiling the leaks, the audits, the delays, and the visible scars into a single narrative that treated the project as a futuristic mirage. A city can always insist it is proceeding as planned. It can't easily argue with stillness, especially when the stillness is photographed from orbit. Even then, the story did not resolve into a clean cancellation, because clean cancellations are admissions, and admissions don't match the operating logic of a project nested inside national identity. Reports suggested that by late 2025, the internal answer wasn't stop forever, but rephase, focus on a much smaller pilot, perhaps a core of a few kilometers, with the rest postponed deep into the future, and budgets for 2026 reflecting reduced NEOM spending. This is how a utopia survives its own impossibility. It shrinks until it becomes an exhibition piece, something that can be toured and filmed, a proof of concept that allows the larger claim to remain rhetorically alive. The line becomes a metaphor again, which is safer territory than steel. The state can keep the brand while renegotiating the reality. Investors can be told the vision is intact while the accounting tells a different story. Everyone can pretend the revision is strategy rather than necessity. On the ground, by early 2026, the most honest description of the line was not the one in the press release, but the one a satellite could corroborate: massive excavated canyons, sections of concrete foundation, tunneling underway, and only a few kilometers of visible work in a plan marketed as 170 kilometers of mirrored wall. The promised 5-minute walk existed mainly as a diagram. The lift movement on site remained buses and heavy equipment connecting camps, fabrication plants, and trenches. The promise of a radically new urban form existed as a brand. The built reality existed as a frontier construction zone with the usual hierarchy of contractors, subcontractors, guards, and laborers. The special governance existed as a set of claims without a publicly legible charter. The outside world's version of evidence had become an archive of denials, leaks, and aerial images, with dates attached that didn't line up with the original prophecy. Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti's last contribution to this story was not a speech or a manifesto. It was the fact that his refusal produced a record, videos posted before his death, an international news cycle after, and then years of rights documentation and UN statements that kept returning to the same point. A future city was being built on land that already held communities, and the method of clearing that land did not resemble a voluntary lifestyle upgrade. When the project was sold as preserving 95% of nature, his village and others like it were treated as removable obstacles in the remaining 5%. When the project marketed itself as a new legal environment, his case showed what happened when a resident tested the boundary of consent. When the outside world started calling the project a mirage, it wasn't only because the mirror walls were missing. It was because the line, drawn as an icon of harmony, had been enforced as a border. A line can be drawn in a press release, in a budget spreadsheet, in a satellite image, and in the place where a home used to stand, and those lines do not carry the same kind of truth.